Hello and welcome back to the REFramework. We've seen in the previous videos how to implement tabular data within a REFramework project. As you've already seen in these test cases from the previous course, the REFramework template by default uses the queue items. To use these pre-built test cases, we'll have to modify them so that they work for tabular data or any other data type, depending on the use case. Our goal here is to see how we can test a built project by modifying pre-built test cases from the REFramework template. Please note that for this demo, we're presenting pre-configured test cases for our project. As you watch the video, you'll notice some differences between the workflows that you'll use in building. Don't worry, we'll provide configuration instructions wherever necessary in this video so that you can build along with the instructions. Without further ado, let's begin. Under the Tests folder, we have 7 pre-built test cases that need to be customized to make them work for our project or use case. The default pre-built test cases are General Test Case, Get Transaction Data Test Case, Init All Applications Test Case, Init All Settings Test Case, Main Test Case, Process Test Case, Workflow Test Case Template. Let's begin with General Test Case. General Test Case.xaml is a data-driven test case, and it takes the input data from our test data Excel file. The test sheet describes the workflow paths and the expected results of the workflows to be tested. The expected result can be either a system exception, a business rule exception, or a success. General Test Case can be used to compare expected results with actual results after passing through this list of workflows as test data. After the run, the status of each workflow can be either a pass or a fail. If the exception caught matches the one previously defined in the tests sheet, the status is pass. Otherwise, it is fail. Let's run this file with data variation. Let's select the workflow file that we want to test. The expected result for both of the workflow files selected is a success. As mentioned earlier, this data is coming from a text.xlsx file. Let's click the Run button to see the actual outcome of our project. The general test case execution started, and the output panel shows the actual result as success for the first workflow file, as well as for the second workflow file. In both workflow files, the expected and actual results are the same. Thus, we can say that both workflow files passed the test case. Okay, we're done with the general test case. Now let's discuss the testing features included in the REFramework. This way, we get an easy method of unit testing for all of the workflow files of our project. We have a test case for each workflow that we invoke throughout the REFramework template. Let's go through each and see if it behaves as expected. Let's start with the Init All Settings test case. This test case performs a test to see if Init All Settings works properly or not. It checks if settings were successfully initialized, if a config dictionary was created, if it contained a particular key, etc. No changes are required for this test case. In this test case, the Init All Settings workflow is invoked in the When section. We verify whether the config dictionary was created and contains information by using the condition config.count in the Then section. If config.count contains data, the result will be greater than 0. Following the confirmation that the config object has been created, additionally, it checks that the max retry number setting is present in the config object using the condition config.containsKey, open brackets, open quotes, max retry number, close quotes, close brackets. This is it, so let's run the file. It works as expected. The verification has passed, meaning that the config file exists and contains data. We're all done with this first component. Let's now see the Init All Applications test case workflow. This test case checks if the initialization of applications works as expected. If we take a closer look in the given section, Init All Settings workflow is invoked as input to the Init All Applications test case. We want to test the Init All Applications workflow, so it's invoked in the When block. In the Then block, we see the activity Verify Control Attributes. The purpose of this activity is to check whether a UI element should appear on the screen once the application has been launched. After the Verify activity output, Close All Applications workflow file is invoked to close the open application. A few configurations are required for this workflow to work for our project. In the Verify activity output activity, we've added a Check App State activity. Check App State activity is configured for the UI demo app. In the Expressions section, we added the value True. We hope that you've completed your project in the right way, but in case you get stuck, please refer to the attached project at the end of the video. It's time to test the Init All Applications workflow file. So let's run Init All Applications test case. The execution has started. The UI demo application has been opened. Credentials are being entered. It's now checking if the indicated UI elements exist in the UI demo application. In this case, it's UiPath, and it's closed the application as intended. Let's go to the output panel and take a look at the result. As we can see, it returned the value True. Hence, the Init All Applications workflow passed the test and ran as expected. Next, let's continue with the Get Transaction Data test case. In this workflow, we have the logic to check if the transaction item is not nothing, meaning if the transaction item contains data, we'll be able to process it in the next stage. In the Given section, Init All Settings workflow is invoked, and the transaction number value is set to 1. In the When section, of course, we invoke the workflow which we want to test. That is, Get Transaction Data. In the Then section, the condition transaction item is not nothing is used to test if the required transaction item was retrieved. By default, REFramework is designed to work with the queue items, and we modified the template to work with the tabular data. In a similar way, these default test cases are also designed for the queue items. So, to accommodate the tabular data, we need to make a few configurations. For the out_transaction item argument, we've mapped the value as the transaction item variable and changed the data type of transaction item variable to data row from the variable panel. The last change that we made is removing the block if transaction item is not nothing, since we aren't dealing with queue items. Please do these changes in your project. In case you get stuck, please refer to the attached project at the end of the video. Let's run this file and watch what happens in the output panel. Execution of Get Transaction Data test case has begun. Initializing the setting, getting the transaction item. The message here says, Verification passed. The expression transaction item is not nothing returned true value. And there it is, the verification passed, and it ended the execution. So, Get Transaction Data workflow file passed the test case. Next, let's open the Process test case. In order to process the transaction item, our configuration should be ready. We should have all of the required applications open, and we should have some transaction items to process. As a result, in the Given section, Init All Settings, Init All Applications, and Get Transaction Data workflows are invoked. Since we want to test the process.xaml file, it's invoked in the When block. As with the Get Transaction Data test case, we also need to make a few changes here. In the Invoke Get Transaction Data workflow, the in_transaction number argument has been mapped to the transaction number variable, and out_transaction item is mapped to the transaction item variable. Next, in the Invoke Process workflow, we've mapped the in_transaction item argument with transaction item variable. We've changed the variable type of the transaction item from queue item to data row in the variable panel. In the Then block, we've already configured the activities needed to confirm the processing of the transaction item. To obtain the transaction number from the UI demo application, which is generated once the transaction is processed, we use the Get Transaction activity. We've set the expression extracted transaction number, and it should not be empty to pass the verification. Please do these required changes in your project too. In case you get stuck, please refer to the attached project at the end of the video. Now let's run this test case. Process test case execution has begun. The application was opened and credentials were entered. The retrieved data is being entered into the appropriate fields in the UI demo application. Now let's look at the output panel to verify the result. And here's the message, verification passed. This means that process.xaml also passed the test case. Now it's important to note that our test cases should include error handling. If the UI elements interacting with your test case aren't available, make sure that we've implemented the necessary error handling actions to catch any exceptions that may occur. Having learned about all of the default test cases, we now know how to configure them according to our requirements. Now at this point, you might be thinking, how can I test the custom-built workflow? REFramework also comes with a template to create our own test cases if required. We've used the workflow test case template to create the custom test cases for UiDemo_open and UiDemo_add_transaction. Now let's take a look at the custom-built test case for UiDemo_open. So, first we copied workflow test case template and we renamed it as UiDemo_open test case. By default, init all settings workflow is invoked in the given section. As we're building test cases for UiDemo_open, UiDemo_open workflow is invoked in the when section. To determine whether it successfully opens the application, we added a required activity in the then section. If you wish to build a test case for the custom-built workflow, you can do the necessary changes to the workflow test case template. Now let's run this test case. The workflow will determine whether it was able to successfully open the application, log in, and reach the page containing the title. If anything goes wrong, it should fail. We should be notified if this workflow was not developed correctly, or the application did not behave as expected. It opened the application and logged in successfully. Let's check the output panel. Here in the output panel, we see the message that says verification passed. The output value of exists true was equal to the expected value true. As a result, UiDemo_open custom workflow passed the test case as well. Awesome! We've also built a test case for the UiDemo_add_transaction workflow in order to ensure that it processes an item correctly. Let's take a look at the test case built for UiDemo_add_transaction. This was also built using the workflow test case template. As you might have noticed, we invoked the UiDemo_open workflow in addition to the init all settings workflow. As we're testing UiDemo_add_transaction, we invoked this workflow in the when section. We've added the required activities for checking or verifying the successful processing of the transaction item. Now let's run this test case with data variation. Let's select the data set to process and click the Run button. As a result, each of the data variations that we selected will be executed separately. It will just check whether the transaction was successful or not for the selected data variations. It's first processing the first data set and closed the application. It opens the application for the second data set. And it's processing the second data set and closed the application as we intended. In the Test Explorer, we can now see the results of the test cases that we executed. There are details about what workflow was used, what activity coverage we got, how long the execution lasted, and so on. For testing your customized workflow, please use the workflow test case template, just as we did for the UiDemo_open and add transaction workflows. Let's take a closer look at main test case.xaml file. It checks whether the status file or report built after the process run is the expected one. It's configured to verify if the obtained output is the same as the one expected. Assuming that we'll get a report after running the file, we're going to read the resulting data and compare it with the expected data that we've declared. Okay, we're at the end of this video in which we've demonstrated the testing feature of the REFramework template with Test Suite. Here are a few reflection points after testing these workflows. What key information is stored in the test data Excel file? What does it mean to run our file with data variations? What are the differences between testing a REFramework project with tabular data and one with queue items? What workflows did we test and did we receive the expected result for all of them? Here's the challenge for you. Create a test case for your custom workflow using the Workflow Test Case template. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy automation!